Oh, hello. Recent events, mostly referring to how AI has become a lot more popular lately, at least at the time of making the script, has caused me to think about how the accessibility of things can actually change how they're seen and even how they're used, promoting this idea of perhaps there's a point where something being more accessible is actually a bad thing. And thus, this is a video about overaccessibility, or the term I'm using to refer to when something becomes so available it's actually causing negative effects. Now, this isn't to say that having something be accessible in general, regardless of how, doesn't cause some form of positive or negative effect. There's always consequences to something. I'm mostly referring to the idea of when something has reached a form of like breaking point where the making it any more accessible only seems to make things worse and not make anything better. An example that I like, both due to its popularity and the impact it has, is the internet. The accessibility of the internet and, well, the things necessary for it, like computers and software, has granted amazing advantages in communication and the ability to have remote access to things like tools and information to do things with, allowing for people to become essentially independent creators where they make things themselves, do things themselves, and things that previously were only possible by large groups of people that had enough money to have such resources. However, there's obviously a lot of consequences that come with this, like how such advantages in communication has ultimately exaggerated what could be said is an already existing problem that exists with communication in general. The more you can spread things like being able to talk to people, people can now do things like spread rumors far easier because now they have more people that they can talk to, more ways of talking to them. You also have things where like the accessibility of tools and computers for like the information that's accessible to the internet and the ability to be spread via the internet has allowed the ability to create and spread things like faked pictures, videos. There's things for deep faking people's faces onto other people's faces. You can Photoshop people into pictures they've never been, animations or videos that they've never been in. You can essentially fake just about anything now. Things that previously were considered trustworthy, like videos, audio recordings, and pictures, because of how difficult it was to fake them in the past, have become completely untrustworthy because the ability to edit them has become so much more possible and common. They can't be used as evidence of anything anymore, at least not in a way that's trustworthy. This could be said to be an issue of just it's gotten too popular to manage. It's not too hard to see if you visit some form of internet forum or any place where, a lot of users are accessing and adding things to something that it's almost impossible to manage. As much as people would want to be able to manage it, there's almost no real way to do it without, in many cases, actually just limiting the number of people that have access to it at a time. There's no number of moderators that would be good enough to be able to manage all these users unless there was literally a form of moderator for every user. And even if you automate it, oftentimes the automation has to be limited because, again, the more you add to moderate something, the more you slow down this communication, inherently defeating the point. And thus, it could be said that it's gotten to the point where it's too big to manage. There's also the idea of this being possibly more of an issue of multiple things being made accessible together, basically compounding the accessibilities of different things. Tools being more accessible, as in, having more of them, doesn't necessarily pose a problem on its own because it just means more people can have multiple of them, or if more people could somehow get there, they could have one themselves. Or you have in the case of like digital goods where in cases they're more accessible because they're made cheaper, or in some cases free for different software like Krita and Blender. That makes them more accessible, but just because more people could purchase it doesn't really mean that there's going to be an issue entirely there. That only just makes it a little bit more popular to specific groups. But once you make it
accessible remotely, being able to download it from just about anywhere as long as you got a computer and internet. Well, now the spread of it is almost impossible to manage or even know exactly how it would work, because now you've just made something more accessible and then made it even more accessible. And you basically, by doing so, compound the accessibility and thus could possibly be compounding the problems that these accessibilities can create. The internet can be a difficult one to really say whether or not it's overaccessible, as it also brings many good things as well as, some bad things. So, to really paint a picture of something that obviously is overaccessible, an example could be something like literally everyone having a nuclear bomb. There's not a lot of point in that because many people don't have such use to make such a big boom, and thus many people probably just wouldn't use it. But the accessibility of it becomes problematic because now you have a bunch of other people, because while you yourself might not have any purpose of it and you're just not going to use it, you can't guarantee other people aren't going to use it, which means that you've compounded the problem of, oh, there's no real demand for normal people. You can't control the fact that there are probably going to be people that abuse this accessibility to use it for things that you wouldn't want them to use it for, such as just randomly blowing things up, since, that would be the only real use of it for people, is to, abuse it. The people that want to use it for the things you don't want them to. That was also a good example of how overaccessibility is normally an issue of other people having access to something. Because most people don't have a problem with having access to something themselves, where obviously there are issues where having access to something yourself can be detrimental. In most cases, the issue is other people having access to something because you can't control necessarily how they use it, so having it be more accessible can become problematic for you and others. The example also pointed out the fact that if no one really wants something, making something more accessible when there's no real demand for it basically makes it over accessible, because you're only going to be exaggerating problems if there's no real thing that it's being a solution for. As a way to wrap up the idea, in general, it can be hard to tell if many things take it too far, because many things actually have quite a bit of positives as well as, some consequences that are negatives. But as one could always claim that it would be inevitable to get there, with progress making you, basically forcing you down that path, and that it would simply be better to find ways to deal with the issues rather than just limit it. Unless, of course, people don't want the thing in the first place, because then you end up with the case like everyone having a bomb. It's kind of pointless and mostly just creates a bunch of problems. Like, really, what am I supposed to do with this radioactive object that I now have? I feel kind of sick now. Radiation poisoning and all.